So in today's video, I'm going to be basically discussing what is the potential with all the news and the attention focus from around the country on Los Angeles, understandably so, as tens of thousands of acres burn up and dozens of casualties are reported and just complete utter destruction is occurring down there in the Palisades and these other parts of Los Angeles right now. I mean, the fires, as I record this video, are still ongoing, and it's just amazing that we've been at this now for just about a week of just total disaster. And you can see from some of these aerial photographs just the widespread damage that's been done by these terrible brush fires and now structure fires that have just spread far and wide in California. Now, this is particularly significant because there's inevitably a lot of questions that get raised by the incompetence or failures of political leadership in local government. We talk about this a lot, and I know I've had a lot of discussions on my show over the years, really going back, it's about 15 years now, discussing how important the quality and significance of local governments and the people that you put in charge of it, how important that really is to you. In fact, it's more important, I'd argue, is to your just daily well-being if you have good local elected officials than compared to what happens back in D.C. in many cases. If D.C. disappeared tomorrow, those of us who live in Washington State, we probably wouldn't notice, but we would definitely notice if our fire hydrants basically didn't work and the reservoirs went empty and we couldn't get water and electricity failed, the roads collapse, the bridges collapse, the roads don't work, or crime is everywhere. These are basic things that it is very hard to escape. And when you have goofy people like this running your government, unfortunately, the likelihood of bad outcomes simply escalates and becomes more and more certain. And all it takes is just that one spark or some other event that turns you into the next Detroit or Los Angeles, whatever it is. So the main focus today, and I wanted to just get into this a little bit, is which cities in Washington State, just due to political mismanagement, incompetence, corruption, bad choices and decisions in the past, are most likely to become the next Los Angeles? Well, stay tuned, you'll find out. Before we get there, I just want to encourage you, if you haven't subscribed or liked this video, please do that down below. Please feel free to take a couple minutes to do that if you haven't subscribed. Probably about 40%, 50% of you are not subscribers, so I always appreciate if you can. It gives me a better sense of the attention I'm getting on this video and others. Also, if you think I missed something, and I certainly have, feel free to leave those comments in the comment section down below. I do try to read most of them, and I do my best to respond where possible. And in fact, I'm going to be asking some very specific questions that I'd like you to comment on towards the end of this video. Also, feel free to share this video with others. It's the only way to really get the word out there and spread it far and wide. So let's get back to the fires and the concerns that we might have about incompetent political leadership and how that can ultimately result in just complete disaster. Now, when we talk about cities burning outside of just a war zone or some other conqueror coming in and willfully destroying a city, we think of things like the famous story of Rome burning while Nero fiddled. I mean, it's a famous analogy that people will oftentimes use when they're discussing political leaders who are essentially ignoring and failing in their duties to just care about the people that they supposedly are leading at a political level. Now, even though I know that they've argued that Rome was burning and Nero wasn't anywhere near Rome, so he couldn't have been fiddling while he watched it burn, the belief at the time was pretty strong that he was incompetent and not doing a good job. And of course, that's why you end up with memes like this, where when Eastern Washington was burning, as it has a number of times with our incompetent and disastrous forest management plans in Washington, modeled on the failures of California, you're going to see situations like this where we're basically having memes and images of Inslee fiddling while Washington burns. Now, the difference is, of course, this time of year in Washington State, certainly in Western Washington, you probably couldn't start a fire with napalm and a flamethrower. At least you wouldn't have it go any further than the immediate area, just because it's so wet and we have so much rain this time of year. But that's not true for a couple months out of the year. And it's also, unfortunately, true that we've had other cities. It's not just Rome that's burned. The most famous city fire that if you had any exposure to any kind of education, you would be aware of the stories that came out about the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, which was considered very destructive. And the origins of that fire are not certain, but the whole city burned down. It was terrible. You also, if you are even more familiar with your history, in London, when it burned down in 1666, this was actually led to the belief by many people at the time, particularly those who in the churches, to believe that this was the end times and the world was coming to an end because the whole city burned down in 1666. However, you don't have to go very far in the Pacific Northwest, and you can see similar stories when Portland burned down, for example, here in 1866. And anybody who's paid any attention to Seattle and taken the underground tour with the other tourists up there, you might know about the Seattle fire in 1889. Now, interestingly enough, this actual Seattle fire, which did destroy much, and I think it started in a glue factory in downtown Seattle, that fire, that same year, that was the year Washington became a state and was no longer a territory that year. That same year, Spokane and Ellensburg also burned up. So it was considered a terrible year of forest fires. The mayor of Seattle at the time was Mayor Moran, who shortly after this, a number of years later, he actually moved up to the San Juans. And if you're familiar with Moran State Park, he was actually the guy who bought that land, fixed it up, and ended up donating it to the state as one of the first state parks in Washington State. I've camped there many times with my children. But Seattle burned down, and as did many other cities. Now, the thing about this historical stories about this is that it's usually our belief today that we have modernized and learned from the failures of the past. I mean, after all, back when Rome was burning or Seattle was burning, they didn't have 747s able to drop just tons of fire retardant on forest fires or brush fires when they pop up. We actually had this happen not too far from where I live, down in Rochester, Washington, South Thurston County, and the 747 happened to be available. It was a brush fire that started in late summer, and it was burning across I-5, and the fire chief actually got a 747 that came in super low. It was an unusual thing to witness, and I did witness it at the time, the 747 just coming in right on the deck, dropping this massive plume of fire retardant, and it substantially stopped the fire and helped with the firefighting efforts at the time. But we have lots of modern equipment, lots of awareness and more knowledge than they would have had in the past with the technology to have fire trucks and fire hoses and fire hydrants and reservoirs and a massive amount of bureaucracy and taxpayer dollars that supposedly go in to making sure that our cities don't burn down like they used to last century. That's at least the theory. I mean, you might have Antifa come out there and burn parts of Portland or parts of Seattle down, but our general assumption is that you're going to have the fire department there to at least put it out before it gets too far. And LA is demonstrating that with the proper political leadership, you too can find a way to destroy the most modern city, no matter how much tax dollars you've been extracting from the people. And it is impossible, really, to exaggerate the level of incompetence and poor decision-making that can actually be aggregated together in one place, and in a unified front of incompetence and poor choices, you too can destroy even your wealthiest neighborhoods very quickly if you choose to do so. And if you elect people like this, that is the inevitable result. Now, I found an interesting article from a couple years ago, and it had to do with a presentation at Harvard by one of the professors. And the title of this article was actually "Effectiveness in Government is Not Something That One Can Just Assume." Now, I believe that the general tenor of this presentation was, of course, to attack Republicans. It usually is. But, of course, the overall theme is pretty accurate. We can't assume just because government has been effective at times in the past that it's going to be carry forward in some type of effective way. It probably won't, and it sure as heck won't if you elect incompetent, corrupt, ignorant, self-serving political creatures who really don't care about helping their community or doing the work that's oftentimes kind of boring to ensure that things like bridges don't collapse and that you have effective firefighting capabilities. This is a challenge. So one of the questions that's come up is which cities, as I teased in the beginning of the video, and I'll answer right now, and this is based on just an initial survey, and I want to get into more detail on this later, but what are the top 3 cities in Washington most likely to become the next LA? Now, like I said, it doesn't mean that they're going to burn down in the same way, but they may turn into the next Detroit, or perhaps the Dinkins, New York era, where New York City turned into a complete crime disaster zone, or some other natural catastrophe could just simply be the tipping point on top of decades of political incompetence and bad decisions that really lead to disastrous LA equivalent self-immolation of a city because of just pure incompetence. And this is a good question, and the answers probably aren't going to surprise anybody. I would say that rating it on the LA level, Seattle's probably the closest city in Washington state here to actually being having the potential to be completely destroyed. You have an exceptionally disastrous city council, and even though the craziest of the crazies weren't elected in the last election cycle for mayor, you still have just simply a variation of the same flavor, where there doesn't seem to be enough money in the world, and they do things like create fake road diets, turn themselves into sanctuary cities so they can attract as many violent criminals from around the world to make sure that the drug cartels have free reign in downtown. You have a high rate of crime that's escalating higher than it's been in the past, at any time recently in the past. And you have a collapsing public school system. You really have kind of a perfect storm of failure in a place like Seattle. And you don't have any good oversight because King County is essentially equally incompetent at the governing process. And there's no help coming from the state legislature because all these people are generally linked together in the same kind of progressive world mindset that devalues anything like public safety, ensuring that the police have support, or that basic public services are going to function in case of a real issue. They're very good at ensuring that everybody knows what their pronouns are. They're going to be very good at virtue signaling all kinds of esoteric and obscure, and frankly, a lot of it fairly unimportant issues. They'll be very good at that. They'll be very good at giving out grifting kickback operations to all kinds of nonprofits. Normally, even if it's legal, this is what we would call corruption in most parts of the world. And Seattle's probably the epicenter of the worst of this anywhere. But they're not alone, and it's not fair to exclusively pick on Seattle as much as they're simply one tipping point away from becoming Washington State's LA. You also have Spokane, where Mayor Lisa Brown has basically come in charging with a bad city council, and they seem just very determined to try to destroy the city of Spokane as quickly as possible. And anybody who's visited Spokane recently knows that they made a really strong concerted effort there to recruit as many drug addicts and criminals as they can concentrate into one place. Lots of grant grifting operations. In fact, the grant grifting in Spokane started back when she was the head of the Department of Commerce, and she was funneling state taxpayer money into special projects in the city to help her get elected as mayor. And it's not gotten better since she's gotten in there. And of course, the answer, just like always in Seattle, just like in LA, just like in California, is always that when they run out of other people's money, it's just trying to extract more and more, raise taxes, increase the regulations, and make life generally more miserable. Now, I don't think Spokane's reached the level of Seattle yet. They haven't. You had enough decades of competency over time that they haven't totally destroyed the basic infrastructure. It really takes a lot of work to destroy a city. No matter how determined you are to do it, it still takes energy, it takes work, it takes decisions, and it takes usually it takes years of incompetence building up. And Seattle, or I should say Spokane, though, is not that far behind. And with Lisa Brown's Crank It Up to 11 program there in Spokane, she could drive Spokane to be that 5-alarm fire that Seattle could potentially be now. And again, it's just waiting, just that little tipping point, that event, that significant economic downturn, or that protest, or that earthquake, or that forest fire, just away from turning into the next LA. And no surprise, number 3 on this list is the city of Olympia. Now, I've watched the city of Olympia for a long time. You used to be able to elect competent people to the city council in Olympia. There was a time, even in recent memories, where you did have at least some people there who believed math was real, who thought it was maybe a good idea not to turn yourself into a sanctuary city for drug addicts and drug cartels and criminals. But those days are gone now, and generally the city is filled with people who aren't very serious in anything that they do. What's sad about that is the city of Olympia is also the home to a large percentage of the state's upper management when it comes to state agencies, lobbyists, bureaucrats, the managerial class of government. A good percentage of them do live here in the city of Olympia. They do know the difference between competency and corruption. It's just that corruption's a lot easier, and it oftentimes is something that people will sit back and laugh at. And we openly mock the bad people that are in office today. But over time, that degradation of services, just keeps getting worse. And it doesn't matter if you're talking about the wastewater treatment facility that occasionally leaves manholes off and then just pollutes Bud Bay for months, not realizing that's what they're doing. It doesn't matter if it's basically the county, Thurston County, which right now does not have a majority of sane people on their county commission. They have a 5-person county commission right now. It doesn't matter, it doesn't help, I should say, when you have them also downgrading and losing millions of dollars in a building that they just put up, getting caught for over almost $700,000 worth of fraud that they have to pay back the feds. And they're wasting, and they continue to waste more and more money. All this stuff starts to add up. You do have a pretty good sheriff, I think, right now in Thurston County. That protects you. But the city of Olympia is getting riskier and riskier with years and years of mismanagement and more incompetence. Sure, they keep raising the taxes and making it more expensive to live there, just like they do in LA. But you're not getting the bang for the buck, and the service problems and the weaknesses will become exposed when there's something bad that happens. Now, this is just the first 3 cities. Obviously, Bellingham, Vancouver, Tacoma, and other cities they deserve a special mention because those are cities that have the potential to get as bad as Seattle, Spokane, and Olympia. But it is worth mentioning this, and this is something that we want to do more of a deep dive look at in the future. And that's going to be something that I'm going to be asking you to do and to help me with. But until that time, one of the things that I have to remind people is that no matter what, if you are going to be like the people of Los Angeles or San Francisco or the Detroit, other places, and presume that your city, that you're paying all those taxes to, they're actually doing their job and that they're going to get the job done, and that's super risky. I wouldn't put my family at that type of risk, and I recommend that you don't either. Always be prepared. It's a good Boy Scout motto, and it's something that you should do at home as well. And they do encourage it for emergency preparations. Have a plan with your family of what you're going to do if there is a terrible fire sweeping through the community, if crime is out of control and you have to leave, if there is an earthquake and you have no electricity for months at a time. Whatever the drama or the scenario could be that tips your community over that edge, have a plan, be prepared. You better be as self-reliant as you possibly can, because the bureaucrats and the politicians, they're not going to be there to protect you, and the less competent they are, the less likely it is that they will ever be there to help you at all. Now, in closing, what I'm going to ask you to do is my viewers, this is an interesting subject to me and something that I want to deep dive into a little bit more into some of our other local governments in the Pacific Northwest. But I think it requires all of us to sit back and look more carefully at our local governments where we live and do an audit, not the fake audits that the state auditor does. Those aren't real. But I mean, do a deep dive audit into local government and find out how much money are they wasting? How much money are they missing? Do they keep downgrading law enforcement? Do they keep basically restricting transportation choices so that you're always going to be in a perpetual reduction of road diets, for example? Do you have an adequate way to get out of town in case there is an emergency? Is it possible for you to actually be able to do that? Do they actually support their law enforcement? Do they have the ability to deal with serious civil unrest? And that doesn't mean that they just have their dusty white paper reports that that their $100,000 consultants are racking up and stacking on dusty shelves somewhere, but it means that they actually have the capacity to do it. Are their fire trucks working? We saw in LA that a large number of those fire trucks were not being maintained, and so they weren't functional. They weren't able to actually even use them. How is your water supply? Does anybody pay attention to it? Is your wastewater treatment facility able to withstand a couple months without power? I think just basic questions on sometimes the simple things, the parts of government that nobody gets excited about and that aren't the reasons why leftists tend to get into those government offices. They find that to be boring and they don't spend much attention, pay much attention to it. But you and I should. And we can start auditing some of our local governments and finding out just how far away they are from being that 5-alarm fire and that disaster zone that we see in Los Angeles. But in order to do that, you're going to have to show up because you got to get involved. You got to pay attention. You live closer to your city than anybody else does. Get involved with local people who care about the same thing that you do and start paying attention, start auditing, start doing some research into your local government to find out what's going on. It's important that you do it. And it's important that you show up because, in the end, the future only belongs to those who show up.